and you're going to sing and you're going to pray and you're going to open up his word and you're going to read it. But I'm not going to do those things. God spoke, but I'm not going to really follow that stuff. There's really very, very little difference between the practical denier and the intellectual denier. One simply speaks it in words and intellect. The other one simply speaks it by the life that they live. So typically, the person who denies God falls into one of those two categories. There's a woman by the name of Madalyn Murray O'Hair. Most of us probably know the name. She's a famous atheist from a previous generation. She once said this to her son. She says, "Son, I am an atheist. I am an atheist, and I'm an atheist to the core. But I'm an atheist not because I've searched behind every star looking for God, not because I've looked under every rock to prove that there is no God. I am an atheist because I want to live my life as if there was no God." A lot of people won't say that. At least she had the guts to say it. A lot of people won't say that, but a lot of people would simply deny him by the lives that they lead. A friend of ours was visiting with us last night at our house, and we were talking about this very thing. And she was telling us about this person that's in her life, and she said, "He's one of those guys." And we're like, "One of those guys?" The guy who likes to, make the motions of the hands and, "Oh, Jesus," and say all those things, and yet their life is the exact opposite of what they demonstrate. A practical denier of the existence of God. You don't have to write a book saying that God doesn't exist in order to deny him. All one needs is a heart that says, there is no God, and I'm not accountable, nor will I live my life for him and give him my all. It's kind of the opposite of what Christ said when he said, "And thou shalt love the Lord all of who we are." Your strength, your spirit, your mind, your body, all of those things. The person who is the practical atheist is the person who is the opposite of that. Number two, we can deny him. It'll pop up in a second. We can detest him. Look at verses, the second half of verse 1 down through verse 4. "They are corrupt. They do abominable deeds. There is none who does good. The Lord looks down from heaven on the children of man to see if there are any who seek after God. They have all turned aside. Together they have become corrupt. There is none who does good, not even one. Have they no knowledge? All the evildoers who eat up my people as they eat bread and do not call upon the Lord." See, this is a description. This is a description of those people who in their hearts have said, there is no God. And I want you to notice the quality of what is being said here. Now, what I'm about to say might sound a little bit odd. It might sound a little bit funny, but I want you to think about it for just a minute. God does not deal with people, God does not deal with the God denier on an intellectual level. God does not deal with the denier on an intellectual level. Notice that he simply says, "Fool," end of story. That's it. That's what he has to say. He doesn't go on and on about all these different things. Well, why don't you believe in me? Here's my book, and the book says this and this, and then look at the world, it says this and that. God doesn't deal with the believer intellectually. But then notice all of the things that he says here. Notice all of the things that he gives as he deals with the unbeliever. He refers to the action of that person. See, you frame it differently, and you can reason. God is saying you can't reason with the unreasonable, person. But the problem is really the mind. The problem is really the mind, not the mind, I should say, but a moral problem. It typically boils down to either a moral problem or an emotional problem. See, we like to approach the problem sometimes very intellectually. And we think to ourselves, man, if we could just come up with that one argument in that one place at that one time. And what we sometimes fail to realize is that the real problem is not the intellectual part of things. Sometimes the real problem is just simply a morality problem or some type of emotional difficulty or a volitional difficulty. In other words, we simply just don't will to do the will of God. Anyone who wills to do my will know whether these things are from the Father. That's what Christ said, right? Following Christ and teaching the gospel, or receiving the gospel even, requires that we have a will to do his will. So it's not always an intellectual problem. Many times it is a moral issue, an emotional dilemma. So God deals with it kind of on that level. He said, the Lord looks down from heaven. What does he see? Well, he sees that all have turned aside. He sees they've become corrupt. He sees no one does good. He sees evildoers eating up his people like they would eat bread. In other words, they're conducting themselves in these, immoral directions. They're conducting themselves in these ways that are very much contrary to what God set up. But not only what God set up, but what the world expects. You see, God is the creator of the world, and he made this world a certain way. And when we deny those things, it impacts the world. And it impacts the world in a very negative way. So much so that the strength of the argument of the atheist is bound up really in one argument. Why is there pain and suffering? And unfortunately, when we're pointing the question, and we're pointing the finger and asking that question, the answer is right in our hand. The finger's pointing back to us, squarely placing the burden on our shoulders. You see, we live in a broken world. We live in a world that is broken because God gave man free will, and man has choose to sin. And when we choose the immoral behavior, it impacts this world. It impacts this world, and it brings others pain and suffering and difficulty. So we can deny God. We can also detest God by the life that we live. Well, I'm not going to follow him because I want to live how I want to live. I'm not going to abide by his rule. I'm going to create my own sense of morality. I'm going to go in my own direction. I'm going to be dictated by, how I feel and what I want and where I want to go. Save your place there in Psalms and go back just a couple to Psalm 10. Psalm 10 and verse 13. The simple fact of the matter is that it becomes a moral issue, and yet, oddly enough, one of the strongest arguments we have for the existence of God is the moral argument, which essentially says if there is a universal right and wrong, basically, there has to be a source of that universal rightness and wrongness. And that source, of course, is God. But if there is no God, then there can't be any right and wrong. And if there is no right and wrong, then everything is fair game. You going out and killing your neighbor would have no more significance than you going to the farmer's field and picking an ear of corn and eating it and saying, I like that. It's what I like to do. It just all boils down to personal preference. With no rightness and no wrongness, behavior becomes whatever you want it to be. Psalm 10, notice with me verse 13. Why does the wicked renounce God and say in his heart, you will not call to account? You can detest God all you want to. You can not like his law. You can say there is no rightness and no wrongness. But the fact of the matter is, and on most other levels, we acknowledge that there is a responsibility as far as our conduct goes in this world. Why is it that, we acknowledge that when it comes from a guy wearing a badge, or a fella or a woman who sits behind a bar and bangs a gavel? And yet when it comes to, the universe as a whole, we don't understand that it operates on rules. You can detest the rules all you want to, but one day you're going to have to give an account. One day we're going to have to stand in the judgment. And one day God's going to pull out that standard of rightness and wrongness, and he's going to measure up our life to it. And you're going to hear one of two answers. Enter ye in, or depart I never knew. That's what we hear. Some deny God, some detest God, and then he gives us the right answer. You'll notice in that last verse that we read, at least, the last verse that we read, Psalm 14, verse 5, he says, they are in great terror, for God is with the generation of the righteous. God is with the generation of the righteous. Now you dig into some of the language here, and it's not as if, God is with us, is spoken like, you have your God gym bag and you work out at God's gym, but you've never really met him, It's not that kind of thing. It's I carry God's membership card, but I don't know who the guy is. That's not what it's talking about. When it says he is with the generation of the righteous, what he's talking about is he has this deepened sense of relationship with his people. And because of that deepened sense of relationship, there is this strength, this righteousness. And because there is this righteousness, those who deny him, notice the first part of the verse, are in great terror. In other words, when God is by your side and you have a relationship with him, you stand on the high ground of this battle. You're not in a position of weakness. You are in the position where all things are possible. It's a position of power. God is with the righteous. But we need to, and the point is, have a relationship with him. Go over to Jeremiah chapter 29. Jeremiah chapter 29. Just want to read a couple of verses, right around verse 13. Excuse me. Beginning with verse 11, the prophet writes this: For I know the plans I have for you, declares the Lord, plans for welfare and not for evil, to give you a future and a hope. Then you will call upon me and come and pray to me, and I will hear you. You will seek me and find me, and when you seek me with all of your heart. Now, you pick this verse up and you lift it and put it into the New Testament, and you have this wonderful picture of the veil rending in the temple with the crucifixion of Christ, opening up the pathway to God through the shed blood of his Son. You have this wonderful picture of the gospel being spread, salvation being granted unto humanity, and then the building of these close relationships with God. You see faith begin to abound. The fool has said in his heart, there is no God. That's one reaction. We can also detest God, but we can delight in God too. But you see, that requires some things. First of all, it requires that we know God. And you can't really do that without knowing his word, spending some time observing his world, especially those of like precious faith. You can't know him without exercising that spiritual discipline in areas like prayer, where we meditate upon the precepts God has given us to find out how it is we can put those things into practical use in our lives. Nor can you delight in God without a sense of, how do you want to put it, brevity of the life that we have here. You see, God is a big God, and he created a big world, and we look at this world and just it's an amazing thing. And it ought to bring to us humility. And that humility ought to convince us that, our time is short and we need to use it as best as we can. But see, sometimes we get lifted up in our pride, and we see our length of days as possibly never ending. So we never seem to get around to doing anything about delighting in God. We'll live in this wonderful creation and then we'll acknowledge that he wrote a book, but we really don't delight in him. We kind of, are on the cusp of all of those things, never really kind of plugged in to what God wants us to do and be a part of. We must walk in faith. We must have that strength of conviction. And we must see by faith that there is an end. And in that end, we can go and we can be with our God, the creator of all things, and not that place of torment. There's a guy by the name of Robert Rowe, who's an atheist professor from Purdue University. He's educated at Oxford. He once read to his students from his new book, and it said this. He said, even as an evangelical Christian accepts God by faith, I reject the idea of God by faith. But I cannot reject God by reason alone, for there is too much evidence for his existence. It is by faith that I am an atheist. At least the guy was honest, right? When we decide to deny and we decide to detest, it's not as if we're saying no to faith. It just simply means we're putting our faith in something more nebulous, something untangible, something untenable. When we put our faith and our trust in God, then we're putting our faith and trust in his image and his presence all around us, in this book that he wrote for us, and how it all adds up and all proves true. Another guy by the name of O.W. Sanders, he was a journalist in South Carolina about 100 years ago. He was a very popular writer at the time and an atheist. He wrote this. He said, I would love to introduce you to the most lonesome individual on earth. I'm talking about the man who does not believe in God. I can introduce you to such a man because I am that man. By introducing myself, I introduce an atheist or a skeptic that lives in your neighborhood because he's everywhere. You'll be surprised that the atheist envies your faith in God, your subtle belief of heaven's afterlife. He's jealous of your blessed assurance that you will meet your loved ones in the afterlife with no sadness and no pain. This is what he wrote near the end of his life. Folks, that's sad. To think that your life has no meaning, your life has no purpose, and that this whole time you've gone unfulfilled because there's really nothing to fulfill you. There's just emptiness. It's ridiculous. And yet the only other thing that you can do to find wholeness and completeness is to foster this deepened relationship with God. So the question this morning is very simply this: have you? Are you a practical denier? Are you a denier? Do you reject? Do you detest? Or do you embrace God? I mean, where are you? Rest assured, God gives us the way that we can delight in him. He tells us it begins with the notion of faith, by reading his word, by repenting of our sins, by confessing the name of Christ, by entering the waters of baptism, being washed clean, rising to walk in newness of life. That newness of life is just kind of a description of that relationship as it grows. Have you done that? Maybe you have and simply need to return to that path that you once committed yourself to. If you're here this morning and have need, we urge you to make that need known as together we stand and sing.
Since the love of God has shed priceless blessings on my head, I have made it my own. I will hide it in my heart that it never may depart. It shall rule there alone. The love of God within the heart will kindliness and warmth impart. The soul will glow like Jesus in his tender mercy. If the heart is made